All right. The psalm for today is Psalm number 105. Give thanks to the Lord, call on his name. Tell the people the things he has done. Let your songs be of him and praise him, and let your talking be of all his wondrous works. Rejoice in his holy name. Let the heart of those that rejoice seek the Lord. Seek the Lord in his strength. Seek his face evermore. Remember the marvelous works that he hath done, his wonders and the judgments of his mouth. O ye seed of Abraham his servant, ye seed of Jacob his chosen. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the world. This is the word of the Lord. So the goal here is to talk about Marx. Marx is someone I was initially reluctant to even drop into this part of the course because Marx could have numbered his followers in the dozens or maybe the hundreds when the Communist Manifesto was written. He's not the key to understanding the 1840s, or so I would have thought. But he's very much representative of his time. And so in the process of kind of thinking about him as a figure, I realized he's actually really helpful for you to understand sort of what's happening around him. And so the first thing I'd like to do is kind of treat Marx as an interesting historical subject and kind of give you a sense of his context. Now, historians sometimes use this fancy word, milieu. It's French, to talk about the context of a particular moment in time. And I have kind of four different images I want to use here, or four different things to give you a sense of how do most people respond to the crises kind of the time period. Now, and this is a sort of transition moment in the course. Up until this point, we've talked about sweeping forces, like the French Revolution, right? That takes place over a whole generation. Or the Industrial Revolution, which takes place over 100 years. Or a revolution in philosophy like Kant's idealism that really took place, again, over 30 or 40 years. And these are all kind of sweeping forces that are happening over the course of a whole lifetime. And those things are all in play at the beginning of the course. Well, now we're sort of moving into a different era. We're going to talk about specific events and crises, and not just big sweeping ideas like Romanticism, but like things that happen in discrete moments in time. The age of revolution by the 1840s is petering out, would be my first kind of context. People had thought that it would sweep Europe and change the world. And while it seems to persist, it seems like every succeeding attempt at revolution grows weaker and weaker. Now, Marx writes this piece in 1848, and he's expecting this world revolution. But the irony is after 1848, there really are no world revolutions, not for a long time. And the next revolution is a revolution in Russia in 1917, which is really not a revolution of the proletariat. It's a revolution of the Russian peasants, right? And the next world revolution might be the Chinese Revolution, which again is the revolution of Chinese peasants. So history didn't work out quite the way Marx expected. And the slide's sort of supposed to remind you of that. Now, there are some successes. If you're an American historian and you study North or South America, the age of revolution does win, right? So the United States moves into the age of democracy, of one person, one vote. Abolition of slavery becomes an impulse. Feminism and the women's right to vote becomes, like, democracy is really marching in America. And in Latin America, Simón Bolívar sort of launches his own Napoleon-style revolution against the Spanish Empire. And so in America, we get democracy is coming. But in Europe, it seems like the opposite thing is happening. The only exception seems to be France. France is always ready to throw a good revolution, right? So there is one in 1830 that throws off the king, and they create another constitutional monarchy. This is usually called the Second Republic. But they only give about 170,000 people the right to vote. France has got about 30 million people. So, I mean, it's not really democratic. It's more like a small middle class regime. There's another interesting exception in kind of what they would have called kind of the underbelly of Europe. Among the Ottoman empires, you see a revolution in Greece that's successful. Lord Byron actually goes there and dies in the struggle to liberate the Greeks. And the Serbians sort of get their independence. This is a really important spot because World War I is essentially going to start here. the slow collapse of the Turkish Empire will eventually lead there. But that seems like a pretty small thing. Now, this doesn't mean that the ideas of the Enlightenment are dead, but just that the revolutions aren't working anymore. The most famous attempt at kind of a revolution in England takes place, this is what they call the Peterloo Massacre. It's supposed to remind us of Waterloo. But it happened at St. Peter's Fields in Manchester, England. And I don't have the date on my notes there. Let's see. It's in 1819, right? About 60,000 people show up to demand the right to vote. And they're met by the British cavalry, who kind of attack the crowds. They're worried about some kind of a riot. There aren't a lot of people who get killed, but there are about 500 people who get injured, less than 2 dozen kind of dead. And what's more important about that is the British Parliament freaks out. I mean, there's been political violence. And so they crack down, they impose restrictions on how many people can assemble together, kind of like today. Restrictions on how many people are allowed to kind of publish their own newspapers. And while you see political change happen in England, the threat of revolution is just gone. Liberty, when it comes in England, comes because Parliament decides to give the common people just a little bit more. Like in every generation, they'll let a few more people have the right to vote. So in 1832, they decide to give Manchester its own kind of members of Parliament, but not because there was protest, just because we think it's time. And so that when the elite decide to give the people a little more rights in England, it happens slowly. That's a gradualism. I mean, that fits with British liberalism. It's not the age of revolution. So that doesn't mean that Marxist ideas are dead, because socialism is actually growing and becoming more common in Europe. But socialism and Marxism aren't the same thing. This is especially hard for us to work out in America, where people are doing a lot of work with Marx today in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Marx isn't dead in America, but I don't think most people understand the difference between socialism and Marxism. It's like, does anyone want to take a crack at defining what is socialism? No, not even Grace. Okay.
No, I don't want to do this.
No, it is. All right. I kind of set you up like to say this is hard. It's not. So socialism would say that it's about the government ownership of the means of production. So when the government owns the dams that make the electricity, that's a kind of socialism. I wouldn't say government ownership of schools is socialism, because that's not the means of production. But government ownership of railroads, of dams, of factories, of businesses is a kind of socialism. And there are these kind of groups of socialists in Europe and the United States who believed that centralized planning would be more efficient than sort of the chaos of the marketplace. Now, most of the people who try this don't really have political control. They form what they would have called communes to get together and try this on a smaller scale. So this is a design for a city that was supposed to be factories and dormitories laid around a central plan called New Harmony in Indiana. The Oneida community in upstate New York had a flatware company where they made silverware, but they also sort of lived in a commune together, and it was kind of a free love experiment that went really, really, really wrong. You could take an American history class sometime and I'll tell you all about it. So there are people who are talking about common ownership of property because they're frustrated by industrialism. So some people look at, Tiny Tim from Dickens and say, we need more charity. And other people are responding by saying, well, we need more government management of things. But this isn't what Marx goes beyond this. So when we talk about Marx, pay attention to what does Marx adds to conventional socialism. And you didn't really have to pay close attention to part 3 of the manifesto, but part 3 of the manifesto was all about what's wrong with conventional socialism and how we need something better. Now, third kind of context point is to talk about what people at the time called the Hungry 40s. So my approach to capitalism in general has been to say it really did a remarkable job of creating prosperity, better working conditions, better living conditions. I see capitalism generally as being a success. But if there was ever a weak moment in the trajectory of the development of capitalism. When it looked vulnerable, it was the 1840s. It's a decade when there are failed harvests, when the middle class feels especially squeezed by centralization. In subsequent decades, in the 50s and 60s, there's a fair amount of prosperity, and so people are willing to let the system, but the 40s are bad. And the thing that symbolizes the hungry 40s, I think, more than anything else, is probably something you know a little bit about from American history, right? The Irish potato famine. So there were 8 million people living in Ireland in 1845. And agriculture in Ireland had been industrialized, not meaning there were giant factory farms, but that it had been, they decided that the most efficient way to maximize calories off of an acre of land was to plant this really productive crop, the potato. But they took what they thought was the most productive variety of potato and only grew that over huge swaths of Ireland, right? Which, if you've ever been to Peru and studied and look at the potatoes they eat in Peru, where the potatoes from, right? The Peruvians eat like 3,000 or 4,000 kinds of potatoes. And they come in all colors and all sizes, right? So what happens in Ireland in the mid-40s is devastating because there's a fungal blight that settles on the potato and just wipes out 3 crops in a row, right? Like in Peru, this is no big deal because like there are 3,999 other kinds of potatoes and you're fine. But in Ireland, this is devastating. And it's also in parts of Poland and in Russia. But Ireland was particularly kind of captivating to the imagination of people because they were so close to London and the British were supposed to be responsible, but British laws were kind of laissez-faire laws, and so the British government didn't feel like it was its responsibility to do anything. And it was supposed to be the responsibility of charity, but how can charity cope with a problem that's massive? So about 1 million people died in the famine, like out of 8 million people who lived in Ireland. And 1.5 million people left for America, which permanently sort of changes the character of American cities because now they're populated by Irish Catholics and there's a lot of conflict connected with that. But the potato famine really sort of shook up Europe and it made people question whether or not the system really worked. Even today, Ireland doesn't have as many people as it had before the potato famine. The Irish population today is about 6.6 million, maybe 6.7, and it was 8 million in the 1840s. But it's a massive kind of devastating event. Now, so that sort of captures people's imagination. Now, one more kind of bit of context on Marx. Marx writes his manifesto in the spring of '48, kind of leading into this wave of revolutions that sweep Europe. So the map is not super legible, but you can see there are red dots, which is where there had been revolutions in the 1830s. Most of those revolutions are in highly industrialized England. And there's a Greek revolution that succeeds, an Italian revolution that's put down by the Austrian secret police, and a Polish revolution that's put down by the Russian army. So the conservatives in Europe put them down forcefully. But in the 1840s, the revolution sort of spread across Central Europe, and these are liberal revolutions. They're not communist revolutions, right? But these are revolutions of middle-class activists who want a declaration of human rights, freedom of the speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the sorts of things that we enjoy in America today. And that you didn't enjoy in Central Europe because of the monarchies. And the revolutions fail. Almost universally they fail, except in France, where you were always ready to get a good revolution on. So now in France, you move from the Second Republic to the Third Republic, and so France is unstable. But I mean, a couple of different reasons why they fail. In Hungary, the Russians send in the army and crush it. And the Russians have now put down a couple revolutions bloodily, and people are worried about Russian power. Russia then will become embroiled in a war with Britain and France called the Crimean War in the next decade. But in Frankfurt, the place that I think Marx had hoped there would be a revolution, they get together a parliament, a set of delegates, and they write a constitution, and they invite the Prussian king to become their king of Germany. They want to unite Germany in this liberal republic. And the Prussian king sort of very self-calculatingly thinks about this. And would he like to be king of Germany? Oh, yes. But he doesn't want to be this kind of king of Germany. He's not interested in a constitutional monarchy with a Bill of Rights where there are limits on his power. So he says, no, that's a crown from the gutter. I'm not going to take it. And the implication is I'm interested in a different kind of crown. And 30 years later, he will get that crown, but not in this way. And so I'm sort of giving away the punchline before we even talk about the manifesto, but it doesn't work. But Marx sees himself as part of this kind of romantic, progressive movement forward into the age of liberty. So, questions about the context? Okay, it gets crazier from here, because the next thing I want to talk about is George Friedrich Hegel. Hegel is worse than Kant, frankly, and not as colorful. I look for kind of a colorful story about him going on walks or something we could use to capture him, and I didn't find anything. Fortunately, I think Hegel's basic ideas are much easier to understand than Kant. And he had a distinguished career. Kant was sort of unknown in his lifetime and only known by specialized philosophers. And as people then put his ethics into practice in the 19th and 20th century, he became the father of modern philosophy. But Hegel was really famous in his own lifetime. He had a professorship at Heidelberg and then at Berlin. Berlin is the leading university in Germany. And so most of the philosophy faculty of the next generation of Germans had studied with Hegel at the end of his life. And so if you were to go to a German philosophy department in the 1840s and 50s, they would all be Hegelians. So Hegel dominates the approach very quickly afterward. What are his big ideas? He writes a book. You should know the title, although I won't ask you about it on the exam. It's called Phenomenology of Spirit. He takes Kant's ideas about phenomenology and he focuses them on this thing that Kant wasn't really interested in, which is this transcendent spiritual force that's the cause of historical change. Kant is really interested in the individual and on the good person as the basis of philosophy. Hegel, this is just my reaction. I'm not sure if a philosopher would agree with this. But Hegel's really looking for a God substitute, I think, right? Something that's going to be like God and providence directing the force of human events. But he doesn't see a grounding for it after the Enlightenment. So he talks about this world of spirit. His method is very famous. So let's talk about his method, because even though Marx comes to really disagree with this second point here, Marx is profoundly influenced by his method, which is called the dialectical method. So Kant believed that he believed in progress. I think he's the first philosopher we have, maybe besides Rousseau, who believes in progress. We can expect the future to be better than the past. But progress comes because of combat, because of struggle between ideas, between cultures, between points of time. So there will be sort of a struggle between, he would look back in history and say, okay, look at the ancient Roman Empire. There was one group of people, the aristocracy, and they were in a faction and they stood for honor and dignity. And there was another faction, the people, and they sort of stood for freedom and liberty. And they had a combat. And there were good ideas in both sides. And what emerged was the Roman Empire, which was a sort of synthesis between the two of them that had all of these different things. There are things I like about Hegel's approach. Hegelians are taught to always look for the truth in the other person's point of view, right? That truth exists in the realm of ideas, and that if Gavin and I are having a knockdown, drag-out argument about Trump and Biden, like, we shouldn't think that this is a battle between good and evil, that each of us has a viewpoint where we can learn something from the other. And probably 20 years from now, what American politics will look like will be something that draws on both of our, right? So Hegel doesn't use these words, but the words that scholars usually use to describe is there's a dominant idea of the time, the thesis, And then this new idea comes along, the antithesis, and it's sort of captured in this new age in the future called the synthesis. This is essentially what Marx is doing, because Marx would say, well, you've got this feudal society, the thesis, and then the bourgeoisie comes along, and they're advocating industrialism, and they destroy feudalism, and they create a new society, but there are still kind of old feudal values of honor sitting around in our society, even though bourgeois values rule. But now the bourgeoisie are the new elites, and this new faction, the proletariat, is going to come along. As the truth is revealed by conflict, by struggle between these two forces. You can see how Marx is essentially working in this Hegelian frame of mind. This is, Marx takes this for granted, but this is one of the dominant ideas of the 19th century. And I'm not sure if we've developed it much, and Hegel is the place to learn this. This belief in progress through struggle. Because we'll also see it in Darwin, right? We see it in theologians who didn't much believe in violence, but believed that, that there's this development. This is a radical new idea. It's not the idea of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment folks believed in science and that pure reason would allow us to achieve the truth. And then when everyone had the truth, we would stop. Does that make sense? We would achieve perfection. Whereas Hegel doesn't, perfection's always out there somewhere. Like you're always chasing it. There's always struggle. You're moving from one paradigm to the next paradigm to the next paradigm. And regardless of whether or not you like his other points, like this is a really powerful idea today. Okay. One of the problems that people have with Hegel, and Marx really had this with Hegel, is it's too theoretical. So he's really an intellectual who believes that ideas decide everything in the world. He thought that it was the duty of the politician to think about which ideas were true and serve the ideas that they thought were true. And so, yeah, maybe in French culture, they're serving one idea, and in German culture, they're serving another idea. And in the combat between the nations, we'll see which one was best. So Hegel would look at the 20th century and say, well, the United States was serving capitalism, and the Soviet Union was serving communism, and there was a combat between the two of them, and we learned from each other, and they gave up their worst ideas, and we gave up our worst ideas, and that's his view of kind of. Well, lots of people are actually really bothered by this, right? So the Romantics actually don't like this all that much, right? The Romantics thought that creativity should serve the artist, right? Not necessarily some profound intellectual social forces. It's not about the world of pure ideas. It's about how do I feel and what do I imagine? And I don't know the answer, but I'm actually really curious about whether or not Marx is one of these romantic intellectuals who's interested in something closer to here than in a theory. The other reason why Hegel becomes so controversial today is his actual politics are deeply conservative. So he doesn't really believe in a revolution that can solve all the world's problems. And because of that, like, why push for revolution? Like that, this is not the way forward, right? He's famous for saying that the only way to really be free is to do your duty. Quote, the individual finds his liberation in duty. So we are not free as individuals, but in relationship to one another. It's like I have duties toward you as a class, and I find my freedom in doing my duty, and that's what brings me happiness. So I'm not free off alone in the Hebrides inventing Frankenstein and like that. No. Like we exist together. So he's a theorist that really emphasizes sort of organic community. Hegel is not a liberal. He's sort of an anti-liberal, and people who don't like liberalism sometimes are drawn to him as an alternative. But he's not conservative in every sense of the word. We've defined European conservatism as kind of, it tends to be traditionally loyal to a particular dynastic line, like the Romanovs or Queen Victoria, or to the church as sources of order. He abstracts from that. And he has, there are three places in which we owe our duty. And they're not like concrete things, they're abstractions, right? So I wouldn't necessarily be loyal to the Esch family and my father. I would have abstract duties toward family. Or I wouldn't necessarily be loyal toward Houghton College, period. It would be about the idea of the university. And this is what Marx just drove Marx nuts, because it's too theoretical, right? But I mean, and this really shows you kind of what the limits of freedom look like. So most people live in families, Hegel would say. And if you think about, most people in families aren't really free in a romantic sense of the word, or in a liberal sense of the word. He's like, the women in the family aren't necessarily free. They're overwhelmed by the duties that they have. They're confined in their roles. They're subservient. And he would say actually unreflective. They're not very smart because of their family situation. This doesn't bother Hegel. Like, this is just their condition. Women aren't meant to be free in their families. That's their duty. So I make this point not to defend it, but on Friday we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill and his view of women and family, which is genuinely liberal. He's going to want to break. He's going to see that as oppressive. But Kant's going to say, no, that's the way things should be. That's the ideal. The same thing is true for men in civil society. So people aren't really free. They can't do whatever they want. I can't do whatever I want. Like, I have these economic pressures on me. I have to teach. I have to work to feed my family. I'm bound. I'm not free. And I'm in a whole community of people who are competing with each other, and we're not actually free. So he doesn't think that freedom comes from nature or from private association or from individuals. Where does freedom come from? So Hegel is sometimes accused of being a statist. And European conservatives really like him because he says, no, the state, the government is where we get our freedom. Collectively, we can do things that will create freedom for ourselves. So if I have the right to vote, it comes from the government. If I have a right to health care, it comes from the government. If I have a right to get married, it comes from the government. Rights are created by the state and by these associations. You could see why, like, Americans aren't really crazy about Hegel. But philosophers in Central Europe who were trying to put down liberal revolutions were really enchanted by Hegel. And okay, I'm not saying that Hegel is a Nazi, like, not at all, because he believes in a kind of freedom. But the people who are kind of moving toward fascism in 20th century Germany would be really excited about Hegel as opposed to, say, John Stuart Mill. Like, he's a major figure in European philosophy. And there's a certain kind of wisdom, I think, in Hegel. He sees change over time. He sees that individuals don't have a lot of control over it. So he would say, yeah, you do expect some progress in society, but it's going to be slow, and it's silly to try to accomplish it with a revolution. Now, Hegel is the dominant figure in German philosophy for the next 70 years. But his disciples divided into two camps. Fierce differences between the two of them. There are conservative Hegelians and radical Hegelians. So they were generally called the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians. Marx is a left Hegelian. But the right Hegelians focused on duties in these areas and creating a government that's orderly. And because in Prussia, all of the university jobs were paid for by the state, not surprisingly, most university philosophers and political scientists are Hegelian, right? And people like Marx, who wanted to break with it, couldn't find university jobs and needed to find something else to do with their life. Okay, let me give you, we're going to turn to Marx. This is a source by Marx that you didn't read. So this is a piece that he wrote shortly after he left college, when he's in his mid-20s, called the Thesis on Feuerbach. Feuerbach was one of the most exciting left Hegelians of his age. And in kind of reading a couple of short aphorisms by Marx on Feuerbach, we can see how Marx wanted to challenge the dominant philosophy of his time. So Feuerbach was a very abstract idealist. And his main insight was in kind of the history of religion. And he thought that the religion's essence, this the story of God working in history was really kind of the story of, not of a God, but of the human spirit working itself out in this dialectical struggle and moving toward different conceptions of God. And you see Marx sort of wrestling with this. Marx is an atheist, so he likes the idea that religion is some kind of other game and that a God wouldn't really exist, but he just doesn't like the abstraction of it. So we can see Marx's ideas developing here. His thesis number 6, Feuerbach resolves the religious essence into the human essence. Marx likes this, but the human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. Its reality is in the ensemble of social relations. That's Hegelian. We're free in relationship to each other, not as individuals. But he wants to move away from the religious thing and into kind of more concrete social relations. So less ideas and more in the way things actually work. You see this in thesis number 8. All social life is essentially practical. All mysteries which lead theory to mysticism find their rational solution in human practice and the comprehension of this practice. So Marx here is leading to his break with Hegel. Hegel is an idealist. Marx is a materialist. He doesn't believe that ideas are the fundamental thing. Economic reality is the fundamental thing. And so there is nothing more in this world than matter in motion, but it's the struggle between different economic forms which creates truth. Not truth up there in the world of ideas that trickles down to us, but like, no, we create truth here in our struggle. So we see the materialism at work there. 2 more theses, and then I'll give you a little biography of Marx. Number 10, the standpoint of the old materialism is civil society. So there he's thinking about French atheism, which would say, yeah, there is nothing more to human beings than what we are, but they were focused on France. This is a crucial Marxist standpoint. The standpoint of the new is human society, or social humanity, or humanism, essentially. So Marx is not only secular, but he thinks humanity as a whole is the basis for change. So it's not just this, and this is why Marx is going to give up nationalism. Hegel believed, no, everyone lives in embodied communities, right? They live in families, they live in institutions like Houghton, and they live in a nation state like the United States of America. And you can't escape your particular tradition. You're not free outside of your tradition. Whereas Marx sort of falls in love with the religion of humanity, right? And the point of this is to serve humanity as a whole. And this is going to allow workers to serve the world and unite globally rather than just in their little communities. And then this is probably the most famous thing that Marx wrote that's not in the Communist Manifesto. So this is worth writing down, right? He thinks he's something radically new in the history of philosophy. I don't know if he's true actually, because philosophers since Machiavelli, like everyone in the last 300 years has made this claim. This is like, everyone thinks that they're, the best thing that's ever happened to philosophy. But he does have a new idea here. Like, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. They're not there as observers. They're not there as deducers. What's the point of philosophy? The point of philosophy is actually to change the world. This gives us Marx's idea of revolution, right? Hegel would say, well, these changes take place over centuries and they're slow. And we can, as philosophers, we can observe them, but we don't control them. Marx would say, no. Learning the truth about the way the world works it gives you an ideology. It gives you a revolutionary insight. That's power. And you can use the power to change the world because you alone know how the world really works. So Marxism is, it's not a religion, but Marxist kind of claims about truth they're intense. Marxists believe them is that they have the gospel. And this is part of the reason why. Like it comes out of a philosophy that in some way was looking for a different way to understand religious truth. Okay, Hegel is brutal. Questions? Okay, let's talk about Marx himself. I can see from the clock that we're going to talk about Marx on Wednesday, but I've got 2 slides left, so I think we'll get here. I've given you a picture of Marx as a younger man, because I think we imagine him as this cranky old, wiry-haired dude living in the British Library. And this was not the Marx who wrote the manifesto. A couple of quick things about Marx. Marx is from the Rhine Valley. He was born in Trier. His father was a Jewish lawyer. And when Marx is born, the Napoleonic Wars are over. But his father, as a young man, had prospered as a Jewish lawyer living in a space that Napoleon had conquered. So he was free as a Jew from all of the prejudices that his family had lived under for centuries in Central Europe, because Napoleon had created religious freedom. So his father was a very successful lawyer. Before that, he comes from a long line of rabbis. And I detect in Marx a certain kind of rabbinical obsession with texts and study. Like, I can see Marx's great-grandfather studying Torah with the obsession that Marx brings into the British Library, poring over reports, trying to discover the truth about things. There's something, even though Marx came to sort of despise his Jewish background, there's something like rabbinical about his approach. So his father converts to Lutheranism with the fall of Napoleon, because now Trier is going to be ruled by the Prussian government, and to be a lawyer, you have to be Lutheran. So Marx is not raised as a Jew. His father desperately wants him to be a lawyer, and so he sends him off to Bonn to study at the university. Marx spends a year fiddling around with law, and he's one of these young men who's sort of a ne'er-do-well who really doesn't want to apply himself to a dedicated field of study. He falls in love with political philosophy, goes off to Berlin, studies political philosophy there with the kind of, by this point Hegel is gone, but people who knew Hegel are still teaching there, and he drinks deeply from these wells of Hegelian philosophy. He writes a PhD dissertation on Greek philosophy and politics. But he can't get an academic job because he's too radical, because he's not one of these right Hegelians, he's a left Hegelian. So he goes to work as a journalist. He edits a newspaper first in the Rhineland that's funded by liberal businessmen hoping to bring human rights back to the Rhine Valley after the fall of Napoleon. After 2 years, his paper gets shut down by the Prussian government, and he flees to Paris with a young woman who's actually really important to Marx's story, Jenny von Westphalen. Now, anytime we're talking about German history and there's a von Westphalen, the von is a way to signal aristocratic noble family. In German, it's a nice little marker. In English, there's no way to tell if someone's a noble or not. But in Germany, like von Bismarck, well, that means noble. Hitler, not noble. Von West. So he marries a noblewoman's daughter, and the noblewoman had actually become really enchanted by Marx as an intellectual, as a romantic, and so they flee off to Paris. Marx then writes another newspaper, spends 2 more years trying to foment revolution in Paris. Eventually, the Prussian government asks the French government to kick him out, and they do. So then he goes to Belgium, where he writes another newspaper. And this is where he meets Friedrich Engels. Now, Engels and Marx have this partnership that's really powerful. Marx is the kind of the philosopher and the theorist. Engels is no less than an intellectual, but he's a practical man. He'd wanted the kind of education that Marx had, but at 17, he's sort of pulled out of college and sent to work in the family factories. So his parents, his family are industrial plutocrats, essentially. They own large textile film firms in the Rhineland of Germany and in Manchester, England. And Engels spends the next 30 years of his life managing the family's interests, and then also kind of being a communist on the side. His social life is highly irregular. He doesn't get married, he lives with his girlfriend, he does all of the things. So he's not a respectable member of British society, but he's rich. And so between Jenny's parents and Engels, they sort of support Marx's research, and Marx never really works another day in his life. Like Marx's mother actually once quipped about him. He writes so much about Capital. It'd be nice if he came into a little of it. Like, this is a man who knows how to talk a lot about something and never actually encounters it. It's a bit of a joke in the family. And it's worth saying about Engels that he was one of a few people who were able to actually work very closely with Marx. Marx is an ideologue, he's cranky, he insists on really sharp theoretical distinctions. He doesn't know how to compromise. So most people find him impossible to get along with. Engels is either pliable enough or they just agree on enough that they can actually cooperate and they can work together. So this is the context in which they write the Communist Manifesto, which we're going to talk about on Wednesday. But the manifesto is written in '48 in this year of liberal revolution. It fails to attract much attention. Marx talks a lot about how the specter of communism is haunting Europe, but it's not really. The specter of liberalism is haunting Europe, and Marx wishes it was something else. There's a sort of rhetorical exercise here. In 1919, the specter of communism is haunting Europe. Marx's ideas are really powerful, but he's a century ahead of his time. So then he goes into exile in London. He flees. He's essentially unemployed his entire time in London. He lives on the north end of the city, and every day he walks or takes the train down to the British Library, which the British government and its municipals makes available to anyone for free, kind of like the Library of Congress today. So he spends 10 hours a day doing research on industrial reports and the working conditions, and then he spends most of the night sort of writing it up. He has 6 children, his wife Jenny, and a servant to support. Why a servant? I mean, I've always sort of puzzled, like how can the Marx family afford to have a servant? But Jenny is Jenny von Westphalen Marx. She can't not have a servant. She doesn't know how to not have a servant. So the house is kind of a bit of a shambles. They're poor. They're desperately poor, especially in the 50s. So frequently, Marx sort of writes in his diary sometimes that he spends the whole day in bed because he can't afford to go to the British Library because it's too cold. And he literally he pawned his overcoat to buy food, right? So he would kind of sell his coat to the pawnbrokers and they would give him £3. And then he would eat based on the £3, and then he wouldn't have any clothes to go outside with. So he would sit in bed all day because they couldn't afford coals. Like there's real poverty, but it's an interesting kind of poverty. It's a rabbinical kind of poverty. He refuses to work so that he can work on his project. And Engels supports him when he can. Later in life, Engels comes into his family money in his own right. So Marx in his 1860s is actually pretty comfortable. But before Marx has money, he has to beg from Jenny's family. So there's a certain kind of pathos or pathetic quality to this really famous life. Marx spends most of the rest of his life working on Das Kapital, which he obsesses over and never finishes. After his death, Engels is able to get him to stop making revisions because he's dead. And he revises it into something and publishes it the year before his death. Das Kapital is in 3 volumes. It's really dense. It's the sort of thing that you would have entire majors dedicated to in 1930s Russia. If you were a political science major in communist Russia in the 1930s, you would study Das Kapital. And it's interesting, but like in its theoretical insight, I don't think it does much beyond what you read in the first 20 pages of the Communist Manifesto. And he has then like 100 volumes of other papers. So Marxist studies get really intense because there's this huge literature on which they can yell at each other about, right? There's not a lot. And I don't know what liberals are like. I guess liberals can argue about on liberty or Tocqueville, but there's a nice tight canon. One more thing on Marx, this First Internationale. Marx very much wanted to create the revolution that he was always writing about. And he did have some success in getting together, it's not a union, but it's a collection of intellectuals from the working man's movement. And they meet in Berlin in 1864, and they call themselves the First Internationale. And there's supposed to be this network of revolutionaries. We're really talking about a few hundred people, and they are really networked. But when socialism first emerges in England, it's not from the First Internationale. It's inspired by people like Dickens, who just want to make life better for the poor without a violent revolution, or it's by French-style socialism. And if they believe in planning and centralization and using the state to create socialism, whereas Marx's theory is rooted in a secular, violent revolution. So Marxism is something different. We'll see this when we get into the text. And this is what Engels praises at his deathbed. When Marx dies, he's buried in Highgate Cemetery in London, which is actually a fairly upper middle class place. You can still go and see his cemetery today. And Engels gives this eulogy at his graveside that praises him as a true revolutionary, dedicated to the violent overthrow of capitalism and the liberation of the proletariat. Now, there's a lot of terms there. Let me just put a couple terms up on the board in terms of like things either with, some of these we've talked about, some of these we'll have to talk about, but look for these as we read and discuss Marx then. Because we talked about ideology. Ideology was the sort of intellectual insight that would give the Marxist theorist proper knowledge of the world and allow them to leverage revolution. Dialectical materialism is his own unique reading of Hegel. And then, okay, these three terms we're going to get from the text. So on Wednesday, we'll just try and labor through this. What is class struggle? Who are the bourgeoisie? Who are the proletariat? What is communism, which you'll get from part 2. And then there's this word here, which I find is the thing in Marx that's the most profound, but also the most difficult. I am not a Marxist. And if it seems like I'm talking about Marx with a lot of sympathy and you're a little frightened, let me assure you, I'm not a Marxist. But Marx's insight into this, I find really profound. So what is it? What is alienation? Where does alienation come from? This is the thing that also you get from the Romantics, right? The creature, the monster, is alienated. Right? He's completely set apart from society and is tortured and alone. Like, yeah, this is a profound. We'll talk about that. And then historicism. In the 90 seconds I have left, let me kind of give you. This is it's Hegel's basic insight, but then Marx uses it to launch this revolution that has its own morality. Historicism is the idea that the truth of something is revealed by its moment in history. So honor was true for the Middle Ages. Chivalry was the true way that men and women treated each other in the Middle Ages. But chivalry is not true in the 21st century. So that the morality of something is situated in a particular place and time or moment in time, right? We talked about this a little bit when we talked about slavery, right? Hegel sort of has this sense that slavery is something that might be wrong in the future, or now, but not wrong in the past. John Stuart Mill also has this sort of sense of historicism. He can say, well, 100, 300 years ago, it made sense that women weren't liberated, but they need to be liberated today, right? This is not the way people thought prior to this. When we talk about like John Locke or Thomas Jefferson believing in a realm of natural rights, right? When Thomas Jefferson says, that we are entitled to these rights to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, that's a different kind of claim, right? If Grace and I are equal because God made us equal, then that's not historicism, that's timeless. Whereas in the 19th century, after Hegel and with Marx, you get this idea that morality is kind of, it's not that it's situational, it's that it's unique to its particular moment in time. So we might say of marriage, this is a truth that we all ought to live by. And Marx would say, no, that's bourgeois morality. When we create communist morality, we can do away with such things. He's operating from this historicist point of view. Now, you don't have to be a Marxist to be a historicist, but Marx is, I think, the first author that really just latches on that. If morality is rooted in a particular time and place, that means that the revolution doesn't need to be bound by common morality. And you can do things like Stalin did, and they're not immoral. Maybe. All right. Good. I don't know.